keynote speaker from this session will be Joanne Marchetta. Joanne has been with the Tahoe Regional Planning Association for the last 12 years. In 2005, she was hired on as general counsel. In 2012, she became the executive director. Under her leadership, the Tahoe Regional Association has adopted a regional strategic plan that was a collaborative effort by multiple agencies and community groups. Joanne has 2 decades of tenure in the planning and conservation world. She previously worked as the general counsel for the Presidio Land Trust in San Francisco and as a team leader for project manager for the US EPA. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. You know, I'm here from Lake Tahoe, and we are located in the high Sierra Nevada mountains, and we straddle the state lines of California and Nevada. And our little lake is 22 miles long and 12 miles wide and has 39 trillion gallons of fresh mountain water. It's one of the clearest, deepest, largest alpine lakes in the country, and it is an international icon. And it is our little lake that actually drives people together, but not without some bumps on the road. And before I dig in to this, I always like to do a little bit of research about the places that I visit, and I'm struck with a sense of history about this place that we're in right now. 155 years ago, there would have been civil war battles waging all around us, and we were a nation being torn apart. And it was a most divisive time. Not much unlike today. Polarized politics is so pervasive, we're bombarded by vitriol and by messages of division. And I don't know of anyone who doesn't agree that our national mood is serious. Nonetheless, we as leaders in our fields, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to use this thing called landscape conservation to show how our leadership can build collaboration, bridge divides, promote understanding, heal divisions. And there is nothing we need more right now in this moment in time. And it is such an honor to be here with this caliber of leadership that's gathered here. So let's get to it. I'm going to use today the story of 50 years of landscape level conservation at Lake Tahoe as a crucible for our understanding of what we need to lead landscape conservation in this country. And I'm going to offer you 6 best practices that, in my view, are essential to delivering conservation at scale. These were lessons that we learned at Lake Tahoe through not just successes, but through many mistakes. And so I'm going to tell this story and watch how these concepts build on one another. There is no one practice that will lead to success. We need them all to operate continuously, collectively, and interconnected at scale. So, lesson number 1, think in systems. Systems thinking, put simply, is the ability to comprehend and address a whole and all of the interrelationships between the parts. And for us working in landscapes conservation, it's the web of interdependencies that need to be understood, and we think of it as the geography around which we organize. So at Lake Tahoe, that system is a threatened 500 square mile watershed in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And it's from this, it's often a threat that actually leads to breakdown of some sort that pulls forces of people together to engage. And so it was that threat to that watershed. It was in the middle of last century. Lake Tahoe's watershed became increasingly polarized over the threat of overdevelopment. In the 1950s and 60s, when conservation was just in its infancy, Tahoe's pristine alpine ecosystem at 6,300 feet above sea level was literally under assault. Our mountain marshes, our wetlands, our meadows were being lost to poorly planned development. We had high-rise casinos, we had housing subdivisions, we had businesses and lodging that were developed for the 1960 Olympics. We had roads and much more. And people rightfully feared that Tahoe would be ruined. And respected scientists sounded the alarm and the call for landscape conservation. And so today, instead of a population of 750,000 and 4-lane freeways, the region's permanent population is now 1/10 of that size, and it took almost a decade. But in the late 1960s, California and Nevada lawmakers came together, and Congress and President Nixon, all Republicans, signed a bi-state compact to create my organization, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, to protect the watershed. And TRPA was the first interstate compact agency that focused on environmental conservation and restoration on a regional scale. But here was the true wisdom of 50 years ago. The compact set a new regional government boundary, and it drew that boundary as a watershed boundary. And even though 2 states and 5 counties and 1 city and the U.S. government and thousands of private property owners operate in the watershed, there was no single jurisdiction that could protect the lake and the ecosystem. And so implicit in that boundary, the visionaries acknowledged that need to think as a system, as an ecosystem, and that insight came early and it came ahead of its time, and it's created all of our opportunities since. And so in large landscape work, think in systems. It is our prime directive. Lesson number 2. While we love our politics and our turf, we have to get over it. Hindsight is always 20/20, and in the 80s, my agency did not have the benefit of hindsight. And despite some early visionary thinking, we defaulted to what was familiar then. We had drawn a system boundary as the watershed, and we treated it just like a political boundary. We wanted everyone else to give up their political boundary for our newly politicized boundary. And we started with the idea that we would simply mandate our way to a healthy ecosystem. And we put in place new regional environmental regulatory controls, and it was the first and perhaps strongest land use and development growth control system in the nation. And we would be the boss of everyone and all. And the approach was in keeping with the preferred environmental approach of the time, right? Command and control regulation. And we didn't think beyond that box. And here's the rub. 2 decades later, despite the strong regulatory controls, the lake wasn't improving. And it wasn't until the mid-90s until we acknowledged that regulation alone does not restore an ecosystem. Duplicative, sometimes conflicting regulations, and sometimes just outright overreach made it very, very difficult, almost impossible to harmonize our plans with the approaches of others. And so there was more litigation than harmony in that first couple of decades. And what command and control regulation spawned instead was dissonance, outrage, anger, and antipathy. And the louder that we said, I am the boss of you, the louder others said, no, you're not. And we started to understand early command and control can create more enemies than supporters, and so we needed this different approach. A strong set of programs to correct the problems of the past and to restore the health of a watershed, to repair the damage done. And we had to admit our silo was perhaps bigger, but no better. And we had to move from my way to our way. And we had to begin to build these voluntary coalitions of the willing. And so lesson number 3, that's all of us on that rock. Lesson number 3, this is the heart of it, isn't it? Partnerships and collaboration are everything. What we envisioned in the mid-90s was one of the largest landscape-scale programs in ecosystem restoration in the nation, on the order of the Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound. The Lake Tahoe Environmental Improvement Program, or the EIP, as we call it. It's a capital investment program for projects to conserve and restore Lake Tahoe's environment and to enhance our outdoor recreation. And while it's called out in our plans as needed to achieve and our adopted regional standards, it is wholly voluntary. Over the last 2 decades, we've knit together diverse missions of 50 EIP partners, and we've implemented 500 projects: water, air quality, forest health, recreation, fish and wildlife. And the governors and cabinet officials signed on very early to work together for the greater good. And in the last 2 decades, we've invested $2 billion from every sector: federal, 2 states, 6 local jurisdictions, and literally hundreds of millions from the private sector. So how did we do it? To steal a phrase from former Secretary Sally Jewell when she addressed our 2014 national conference, we achieved it through epic collaboration. We started with the public sector, federal, state, local. We used legislative and funding strategies. We were successful in enacting bipartisan state and federal funding authorizations and bond authorities to implement our restoration projects. And this is important, and the private sector signed on right from the very beginning. We knew early on that we needed the public-private partnership for results and to leverage public monies. Our congressional and elected delegates always wanted to know, where does the private sector stand? And when the private sector stood with us and they offered a private share, those public monies always flowed more easily. So fast forward to today, and our successful ecosystem restoration includes now more than 50 partners at all levels: local, state, federal, scientists, research institutions, nonprofit groups, and the private sector. So this multi-sector partnership all working together around common goals. We just marked a 20th anniversary last year, and we celebrated our progress when President Barack Obama visited the lake for the occasion, and he reaffirmed Tahoe as among the most successful and important large landscape restoration partnerships. And when our champions come, they talk about one thing. Across all sectors, they talk about partnership. The partnership building that took 20 years of hard work to reel in each partner and each sector and create new and better relationships, to find common ground, to remove inconsistencies, to get beyond bureaucratic turf battles and jurisdictional lines, and especially to remove the obstacles in people and personalities and process. So the message here: epic collaboration, even when you think it won't work. Like Nike says, just do it. Okay, lesson 4. Think creatively and unearth your old assumptions. Don't be rule-bound. So, creative with your ideas to begin with. Where are you stuck in old thinking and old mental models? Inertia, it means what you are most comfortable with, and it has a way of thwarting change. So this means you got to get a little uncomfortable. It's critical that we expose our thinking to the influence of others in order to change those around us. And today, us versus them is a prevailing culture. And truthfully, we had to blow up that kind of thinking in Tahoe to be where we are today. It's a culture that says our problems are caused by someone else, it's their fault, and so they should fix themselves. And sometimes we actually have to fix ourselves. 50 years ago in Tahoe, the private sector was our boogeyman. So forming partnerships with the private sector was seen as an unholy alliance. It was literally called that. And so today the private sector, in a sea change, is a critical partner and a supporter, not an adversary, not a foe. And because the environment is the largest driver of Tahoe's $5 billion economy that's based largely in outdoor recreation, here's what everyone understands. The environment is the economy, and the economy is the environment. The private sector understands it, as does the public sector. So under that us versus them model, environmental advocates saw us as selling out to the private sector. And yet today, TRPA's new regional plan uses market incentives to help investors redevelop. We had all of these old blighted properties that were polluting the lake and that are sitting idle with no investment. And by reframing our approach that around conservation benefits that could be achieved through development, through sustainable redevelopment, we're now seeing improvements to the lake and on the ground. So this is one of those small examples where get creative in your concepts and let go of your old mental models. Get a little bit uncomfortable. If you can imagine a new creative connection and your first thought is, strange bedfellows, you might just want to pursue it. We also need to get creative with our tools, and technology is helping us on this front, and it can help you. In Tahoe, we learned that if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to see it, it didn't happen. In other words, if no one knows what you're achieving, it really doesn't matter. We figured out accountability was our friend, and in 2016, we launched a new web platform called LakeTahoeInfo.org. And previously, here's how we used information. It was kept, and this is during my tenure, unfortunately, it was kept in binders full of paper, and it took us months to collate anything and report it. And we knew that accountability for results was the key to our support for funding, and we set this goal to become accountable publicly for reporting results in real time. And we have this new public-facing website that gives everyone real-time information about what we're accomplishing in our EIP, what projects are being done, who's funding them, what are our targets, how much progress are we making, how much did it cost. Now, champions and skeptics alike can see the value of their large landscape investment, and it's spurring further commitments to invest and to fund. And so now through our project tracker, acres of forest thinned, acres of meadows and wetlands restored, acres of lake treated for aquatic invasive species, miles of roadway upgraded. We've open sourced this platform so any one of you could adapt it to your own needs and use. This new online platform brings accountability and transparency. So now when a tree falls in our EIP, everyone knows. Lesson 5. And this is a little boring, so stay with me. Governance. Provide clear governance of the partnership. Be intentional around your governance, and then lean in and lead it. I was fascinated recently, I was reading and learning that studies about what accounts for long life, our long lifespan, our lengthening lifespan, identify one factor far above the rest. The quality of our relationships and connections account for your longevity. I think there are analogies here to our organizations. Connection is just as important for organizational longevity as it is for individuals. And it is your governance model that can make your essential connections, your relationships, apparent to your public and cement them in your operating culture so that as people turn over, the imperative connections become hardwired into your operations and they're not lost. So our interstate compact defined a formal governance structure for TRPA. I'm beholden to a 15-member governing board, 2 states, locally elected government officials are key connections, all that have to be considered in our decision-making. But formal governance is so rare that let's just talk about informal. Let's just talk about informal governance. It's far more important, and it's far harder to accomplish. And the EIP partnership that we built was not formal. It was not an explicit product of our compact. We had to create it, and we had to build the voluntary overlay of governance applicable to all 50 of those agencies and organizations that were not directly accountable under our compact. So together with those partners, we created a 9-seat steering committee with membership well beyond the governing board that I answer to. But even in collective governance, that is voluntary governance, it doesn't mean no one leads. There's a need for a backbone organization. I saw it this morning in one of the slides. Collective impact requires a backbone organization. It's one of the 4 essentials. The Stanford Social Innovation Review has written on this if you're interested in it. But TRPA for Lake Tahoe is that lead convener. We are the backbone organization. And we lead not by being the boss. We lead by horse whispering. We make everyone else believe it was their idea. We lead, we raise issues, we solve problems, we discuss and we align around policy, and we've memorialized all of that informal governance through a written charter that's agreed upon, and we created multi-agency work groups for all of our different resource management programs: air quality, water quality, transportation, forest health, science, and more. And then we make those groups talk to one another. So we've also learned that our informal structures need to remain flexible. So we've added core members over time, and we've made important refinements in shared leadership. As our partnership principle has grown and built over time, there are those who questioned, why is she leading the partnership? Why is she the chair? Well, it was baggage of our history that was coming back to bite us, the old vestige of, you're not the boss of me. And so we changed our mental model, and we invited a co-chair to share leadership. So bureaucracies can be very reluctant adapters. Use your governance to reveal your values. And for us, our value, above all else, was partnership. So we changed our governance structure to prove it. When the governance structure isn't working, the program likely isn't working. So let me give you one quick example. We had a small but very devastating fire in Lake Tahoe Basin in 2007. It burned 250 homes. And it drove this lesson home for us. We upped the ante on our fire programs, on our forest health and fire programs and in governance. And now more than 24 cross-sector partners are working together seamlessly as the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team. We've adopted common multi-jurisdictional plans for the region. We prioritize where to thin and treat acres and how to secure project funding. And together we've treated 70,000 acres. It did take 20 years. So 2 years ago, we retooled yet again. And as context changes, we too had to change to be more nimble and drive resilience. So all of us agreed 15 to 20 years to reduce threats on the first 70,000 acres was too slow, too costly, too inefficient. By broadly adapting that fuels team partnership, we're now planning the next 70,000 acres not as 200 separate projects over 20 years, but as 2 to 3 large integrated water quality, habitat recreation, forest health projects over 5 years. If we work harder to coordinate across agencies and sectors, and we remove and simplify regulatory obstacles, we can treat double the acreage at 4 times the pace and far less cost. And that can be very compelling to funders. So all of this goes to say, Whether your governance is formal or informal, make it very intentional. Assess it often and adapt it when circumstances call for change. Okay, if there was only one of these lessons that I was allowed to talk about, this would be it. If I had to put this at the top of a priority list, this is it. Reinvent yourself continuously and change your culture for the results that you want. All of this work that we do in landscape conservation happens through people, and we simply have to get better at working together amongst ourselves and outside of ourselves. So I'm going to draw here on an author, Peter Senge. We tend to define jobs as you do this and I'll do that and somebody else does another little piece of this and it's all going to come together, right? Except it doesn't just come together. We're often left with just a bunch of pieces. Two essential changes are needed in our work environments. People need to work together. What does it mean? They need to get along. In this morning's breakout session, it was called Civility, Listening, and Connecting. And then people need to be more adaptive. And these are huge changes because it requires something of us. It actually requires personal growth. It means that we move our egos and our insecurities and our fear of change out of the way. And how do you, as an organizational leader, address this? Most critically, you have to become intentional about your desired organizational culture. And then you have to orient everything that you do to that culture. The book, This Sovereign Land, speaks to the idea that government agencies over decades have developed organizational cultures of professional, technical elites who may be more interested in imposing technical decisions than in collaborating. These cultures can prefer a decision structure where you're not all weighted down by these coalitions of the unlike. And so the main point is that your technical elite culture as an agency may be the single largest obstacle that you have to collaborative stewardship. And I'm not picking on you because my own organization was suffering from this when I was just a year into my tenure as director. We did what Peter Senge said is needed for organizational survival. We took a hard and critical look at ourselves. I had a tremendously willing staff who was committed to mission, and we were having real difficulty delivering. We had to admit on routine backlogs, changes in course, do-overs that wasted resources, and my favorite was we were criticized for promoting the I code. The I code is, if I say so, you have to do as I say. And we needed to change, and we did. And I'm known to say technical competence accounts for 5% of success. The other 95% depends upon the ability to bring people together. It's the soft skills in this business that actually matter. Communication, compromise, creativity, adaptability, flexibility, critical thinking, and self-reflection. And that adds up to organizational culture. How did we make these changes? We made a 180-degree change from command and control, and we anchored to partnership as our bedrock concept. And we set a goal to become the very best in our entire region at partnership, both internally within the organization and externally with our partners. And the result was that all those people who were wedded to command and control, they either changed or slowly they've left the agency. And so over 8 years, we climbed a ladder, and it shows in our accomplishments. And in the end, we had to let go of all of our old habits, and we had to jump into the abyss of the unfamiliar and get uncomfortable and build an airplane while we flew it. Okay, so I'm going to wrap. More and more We're all coming to understand that the complexity of today's problem solving does not neatly follow our political and jurisdictional boundaries. And so when any one of you, when any of us see system connections that are outside of our bounds, we have to move toward them. This idea of mega-region planning is becoming the norm. And so setting aside old assumptions and getting creative is essential. And in it, you have to find patience and a broader view and flexibility and setting turf and ego aside. And that's the time to support partnerships and nurse delicate common ground, and then make it stick by being intentional around building your governance. So I built my career on reaching across and dissolving boundaries in these ways, and there is nothing harder and nothing more satisfying. If you're already in the trenches, keep it up. If you're just venturing into this, jump in head first. It'll expand your mind, it'll expand your boundaries, and it will expand your connections, and what we know is that will lead to long life. So you won't be disappointed.